What's going on, y'all? It's your boy Antonio Milian, and this is 10-Minute History, where I believe history should be short, but never forgotten. Before we go into what today's episode is about and the stories, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the direction that I'm going to be going in for this podcast. So, I originally, when I created this podcast, my intention was to produce one episode per day. And what I was going to do is I was going to produce one 10-minute episode per day, and I was going to put it out there every single day. And then I realized that I bit off more than I could chew. And I recently put a poll up on Instagram where I said to people, hey, how do you guys want to consume your podcast? And the overwhelming amount of people said one long episode per week. So I'm not gonna do nothing crazy like change the name of the podcast, but what I will do is I will make one long episode per week, and I will break it up and give you guys about different stories. So that way it cuts down on my editing time, it cuts down on my recording time, because having to record a new episode every single day, write a script for it, edit it, record it, edit it. Editing takes more time than recording. And then also put it on multiple different platforms and then try to create content to put on Instagram, TikTok, things like that. That was taking a lot of time away from my family. That was taking a lot of time away from me. That was taking a lot of time away from just other things. And got some news. I'm going to be starting a job soon, a regular job. So I was a full-time content creator for well over a year, and I need insurance. I have insurance, but here's the thing. The insurance that you get from the marketplace kind of is not good. I'm not going to say it sucks. It's just not good for me. And, you know, as somebody who just needs insurance, I need insurance. So, and then also, you know, you get the benefits from the job, like the 401k, things like that. And while being a full-time content creator is great, being gainfully employed and not having to fight for your next dollar is even better. And honestly, not to get on any kind of political thing, I think America's going into a recession. So with that being said, your boy had to find a job. And I think I got one. So I think I'm going to be starting later on this month. If you're listening to this, it's April. So anyway, with that being said, let's get this party started. I look at everything through the lens of history. And so I was wondering, you know, hey, I wonder what insurance fraud looked like during the transatlantic slave trade, right? And I was thinking, you know, were things even insured back then? And I was like, of course they were. Slavery was a big business. So I did some research, and the insurance industry during slavery was almost as, if not bigger than, the institution of enslavement itself. Everything was covered by insurance. Everything was insured. The slaves, the boats themselves, the crew, etc., etc., etc. Actually, one historian did say that during just the slavery in the West Indies, like Jamaica, the Caribbean, things like that, places like that, 40% of the insurance that was taken out for just slaves themselves. So that's just slaves. 40% of the insurance that was taken out for slaves. So, and I was like, you know, I wonder if anybody's ever committed insurance fraud. And I unfortunately found a horrible fucking story. So also, this is a trigger warning. If you are uncomfortable with death, drowning, things like that, then, you know, you might want to skip past this segment or, you know, mute it. In 1781, there was a slave ship that left the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is now called Ghana. It left the Gold Coast, and it was called the Zong. That was the name of the slave ship. Now, a couple of things about the Zong. It was only meant to carry 221 people. On this particular day when it left, it packed 442 people on. So they doubled the amount that the ship was intended to carry on the ship. They doubled the amount of people that the ship was intended to carry. So if this by itself doesn't tell you what's going to happen or a recipe for disaster, I'm not sure what will. But anyway, on the way, when the Zong left Ghana, it was headed towards Jamaica, towards the Caribbean. And halfway through the ship, halfway through the journey, the captain said that he was encountering navigational errors, right? But the thing that happened was a lot more nefarious than what he said, right? Because the crew also said at that time that they were running out of food and water. So there was only one thing that they could do at that particular time, and that was to throw people overboard. And they started with the slaves. Actually, they started and finished with the slaves. They didn't just start with the slaves. They threw 130 slaves overboard into shark-infested waters. The crazy thing about that is it was later found out that they had enough food and they had enough water for everyone. The real reason that they threw 130 people overboard is because they wanted to file an insurance claim. When they got to Jamaica, they attempted to file the insurance claim. And the insurance company caught wind of what happened because even though it was common at the time to throw some people overboard or for some cargo to die, it wasn't normal for that amount of people. And then they also noticed that the ship was over capacity, double over capacity. So the insurance company refused to pay. The ship company turned around, did a 360 and did a 180 and was like, okay, we're going to sue you. So they took the insurance company to the court in England. And the court in England, the jury, they had a jury trial. The jury was like, yeah, you need to pay these people. The insurance company was like, hell no, we're still not going to pay. They took it all the way up to the highest court of England, right? And when they took it up to the highest court of England, the court gave a really interesting verdict. Well, actually, they didn't give a verdict at all. They refused to even hear the case. The name of the case is called Gregson versus Gilbert. It took place at London's Guildhall in March of 1783. And the Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, said that there was never a legal basis for slave ownership within England and under English law. Basically, essentially, we don't do that in England. That's a colonial thing. We don't do that, and I'm not gonna rule on it. And he noticed that something nefarious had gone on with the ship, both it being over capacity, navigational errors, and the fact that he believed that this was just a massacre masqueraded as a navigational error. And he said there should be a retrial because of the new evidence, and he suggested that the captain and crew had been at fault. Basically, take that back to the colonies and figure it out there. So it appeared that no trial ever took place and the ship owners never got paid. Now, a free man that was from West Africa, Olaudah Equiano, he was also an abolitionist living in England. He tried unsuccessfully to have the captain and the crew prosecuted for murder. But like I mentioned, he was unsuccessful in that. Now, also, because of the pressure from abolitionists after hearing about the Zong, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act of 1788. It was the first law that was ever instituted to regulate the slave trade. And it limited the number of slaves per ship. And in 1791, Parliament prohibited insurance companies from reimbursing ship owners when enslaved Africans were murdered by being thrown overboard. One of the phrases I hate is the phrase, "we are not our ancestors," because if we look at the history of our ancestors, a lot of our ancestors, I mean, not everyone's ancestors, but a lot of our ancestors were very resilient. You don't get to survive slavery, Jim Crow, and just consistent disrespect and disenfranchisement without being resilient and having the wherewithal mentally and physically to keep yourself together. Now, one of those men that was resilient and is an ancestor is a man by the name of Robert Smalls. He worked on a Confederate warship, and one day, while everyone was sleeping, he stole it. Not only did he steal it, he used it to rescue his family. Now, Robert Smalls was born on April 5th, 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina. He was enslaved at birth. He never knew freedom growing up in his adolescence or childhood. He grew up doing odd jobs in Charleston, where he showed an early skill for navigation, ship handling, shipbuilding, and understanding coastal geography. By his late teens, he was hired out to work on docks and eventually assigned to the CSS Planter, a Confederate transport ship. Now, this was during the Civil War, and this was at the cusp of the nation being torn apart because of the institution of slavery. In 1856, at just 17 years old, Smalls married Hannah Jones, a woman 9 years older who was also enslaved. She already had a daughter from a previous relationship. Together, they had 2 children. Smalls was obsessed with buying his family's freedom and even tried to save money, but to buy them for $800. He even tried to save money to buy them for $800, which was the price for freedom back then. The plan didn't work. The man who owned his wife never wanted to sell her, and there was even some intention of him selling her to someone else just so Robert Smalls couldn't buy her freedom. In the middle of the Civil War, Smalls is working aboard the Planter, the ship, the Confederate supply ship used to deliver ammo, weapons, and even mines to forts around Charleston. Smalls is basically second in command of the ship, and he knows all of the signals, the routes, and the travel patterns. On May 12th, 1862, white officers go ashore for the night. And this was a genius move for him, not for them. So Smalls hatches a plan with other enslaved crew members, and they've been talking about this for weeks. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, on May 13th, Smalls put on his Confederate captain's uniform and hat and steps into the pilot's position. With a fake mustache made of coal soot and nerves of steel, he steers the ship past 5 Confederate checkpoints, including one of the largest, Fort Sumter. The guards wave him through. Why? Because he had hand signals and whistle codes from watching the captain. Meanwhile, he picks up his wife Hannah, their kids, and several other enslaved families waiting at the rendezvous point. Once he clears Confederate waters, he raises the white flag, literally a bedsheet, and surrenders the Planter to the Union Navy. The Union officers are like, "What? You did what?" And Smalls is like, "You're welcome." The Union is so impressed, they give Smalls $1,500 as a reward. Now, that's $50,000 in today's money. Lincoln uses Smalls' escape as propaganda to prove that formerly enslaved men are smart, brave, and capable, and that no one under their right mind wants to be enslaved. And this helps pave the way for dozens of black soldiers that enlist in the Union. Smalls becomes a recruiter for the Union Army and helps raise thousands of black soldiers, especially in South Carolina. He personally pilots 17 missions, guiding Union ships through dangerous southern waters. He's shot at, chased, and never flinches. After the war, Smalls buys his former enslaver's house. Yes, you heard that right. He bought the house of the man who used to own him as property. And he lets the widow of his former enslaver live there rent-free. He becomes a business owner, a newspaper founder, and one of the most important black politicians in Reconstruction. He served in the South Carolina House and Senate, then 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. He advocated for public education, black civil rights, and fighting the KKK. In 1895, when white politicians rewrote the South Carolina Constitution to disenfranchise black voters, Smalls said, "My race needs no special defense. The past history of them in this country proves them to be equal of any people anywhere." So yeah, Robert Smalls didn't just escape slavery. He outsmarted the Confederacy, freed his family, saved lives, and then came back to run the fucking government. If this man isn't in every U.S. history textbook, then I don't know who should be. This wasn't just a war story. It was the ultimate flex. Salute to Captain Smalls. And you're right, we're not our ancestors. They were a lot better. What I find really interesting about history in general is that when people at the time didn't fit a specific narrative, what they wanted the world to see, they would just often just throw them to the back burner. They wouldn't pay any mind to them. They wouldn't give them the time of day. And if they did something that was memorable, they would often thank them, but then kind of like sweep their accomplishments under the rug. And the perfect example of this is Claudette Colvin. Before Rosa Parks, there was Claudette Colvin. And before Rosa Parks refused to give her her seat, the 15-year-old black girl, Claudette, in Montgomery, did it first. And she didn't just sit, she fought back. And while history hit the snooze button on her story, she was the spark that lit the fire. She was born in 1939 in Montgomery, Alabama. She was raised by her great aunt and great uncle, working class black people trying to survive in the Jim Crow South. She grew up in the segregated neighborhood of King Hill. From early on, Claudette was sharp, outspoken, and deeply affected by racism. She attended Booker T. Washington High School, where she learned about black history pioneers like Sojourner Truth and also Harriet Tubman. Now, these women became her mental hype team. Claudette boards in 1955, March 2nd, 1955, Claudette boards a Montgomery bus after school. She sits in the colored section. As two white passengers get on, the bus driver tells her and three other black teens to give up their seat. The others get up, but Claudette does not. She said she felt the presence of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth telling her, "You better sit your butt right there." Cops are called, she's forcibly removed, handcuffed, and arrested. Not just for violating segregation, but also assaulting an officer, which she denies. She said, "It felt like Sojourner Truth was pushing me down on one shoulder and Harriet Tubman was pushing me down on the other." Now, Claudette wasn't chosen to be the face of the movement, and that's one of the most complicated things. Claudette was just a teenager, 15 years old. That alone made her too young in the eyes of the male-dominated movement. A lot of people believe that is because she was dark-skinned and not polished enough for public image. Shortly after her arrest, she also became pregnant by an older, many to believe married man, and that cued a lot of moral judgment from black leaders that lended themselves to be a little bit more conservative, or a lot more conservative, depending on who you ask. Civil rights organizations like the NAACP wanted someone who was respectable, married, and middle-aged, and could withstand the media spotlight. So 9 months later, when Rosa Parks, an NAACP secretary, refused to give up her seat, the movement was ready to rally. Parks had the credentials, the calm demeanor, and no quote-unquote scandal attached to her. Even though Claudette wasn't a public face, she was a legal powerhouse behind the scenes. She was one of the four plaintiffs in the Browder versus Gale lawsuit, a case that ultimately struck down bus segregation in Alabama. The ruling came in 1956 and officially ended segregation on public buses. She testified in open court at age 16, facing racist lawyers and hostile questions, but never backed down. Without Claudette, there might not have been a legal victory to match the protest and the boycott. Now, after the sit-ins and after the boycott and after her arrest, Claudette struggled with the fallout. She was labeled a troublemaker. She couldn't find steady work and was watched by police for years. Eventually, she moved to New York City, became a nurse's aide, and worked in healthcare for over 30 years. She lived a quiet life in the Bronx, raising her 2 sons. It took decades before she started getting recognition that she deserves. In the later years, civil rights historians began telling her story. She was included in documentaries honored by Montgomery and had books written about her, like Claudette Colvin, Twice Towards Justice. In 2021, at the age of 82, her juvenile arrest record was finally expunged. Yep, it took 66 years for Alabama to admit that it was absolutely bogus. Today, as the time of this recording, she's still alive, still speaks out and reminds people that history forgot her, but she never forgot the cause. And that's our episode for today. I'm your host, Anthony Milian. I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to give me 5 stars on wherever you're listening. Also, leave a comment below. I'm always open to feedback, and I'm always open to any kind of criticism or anything you want to hear in the future that will make this podcast better. Again, thank you guys so much for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other.